June 6, 1944. Gold Beach, Normandy. 07:30 hours. Sergeant William Davies of the Royal Engineers pressed himself against the steel hull of the landing craft as German machine gun rounds hammered the ramp. Through the spray and smoke, he watched something extraordinary emerge from the surf. A Churchill tank crawled toward the seawall, but this was no ordinary tank. It had no gun turret. Instead, a massive spigot mortar jutted from where the main gun should be. Behind it, another Churchill unrolled what looked like carpet across the beach. A third tank spun rotating chains ahead of itself, detonating mines in sequential flashes of sand and smoke. To his left, a Sherman tank rose from the water itself, shedding a canvas screen like some mechanical sea creature, its turret already rotating toward German positions. Davies had trained with these machines for 8 months. He knew their capabilities, their limitations, their quirks. But watching them work under fire, watching them systematically dismantle obstacles that should have been insurmountable, was something else entirely. The Germans called them suicide weapons, convinced they were death traps. The British called them Hobart's Funnies. They were about to change amphibious warfare forever. Davies had been at Dieppe 2 years earlier. He carried those memories like shrapnel, the slaughter, the confusion, the absolute futility of watching men die because they simply didn't have the tools to do the job. He remembered Churchill tanks of the Calgary Regiment stuck on the pebble beach, their tracks spinning uselessly, throwing up stones but gaining no traction. The chert, those large rounded stones, jammed between the tracks and the bogey wheels. Tracks broke. Tanks became stationary targets. He remembered men pinned against the seawall with nowhere to go, cut down by machine gun fire from concrete bunkers they couldn't touch, couldn't suppress, couldn't eliminate. The Essex-Scottish Regiment took 75% casualties in the first hour. Of the 4,963 Canadians who landed that August morning in 1942, only 2,004 made it back to England. Over 900 were killed. Another 1,946 were captured. The tanks, all 29 of them, never made it off the beach. Some broke down on the shingle within minutes. Others couldn't climb the seawall, which was too high and too smooth. The rest became steel coffins for their crews, knocked out by German anti-tank guns firing from prepared positions. Dieppe proved one thing beyond any doubt: you couldn't storm Hitler's Atlantic Wall with conventional weapons and conventional tactics and expect to live. Something fundamental had to change. The Atlantic Wall was consuming 200,000 cubic meters of reinforced concrete every month at its peak construction. This wasn't propaganda. This was engineering on an industrial scale. The wall stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, over 4,000 kilometers of coastline transformed into a continuous defensive position. Along the French coast, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had taken personal command of coastal defenses in late 1943. He'd seen what Allied air power could do in North Africa. He knew the invasion was coming, he just didn't know where, so he fortified everything. Beaches were turned into killing zones through methodical German engineering. Steel obstacles jutted from the sand at precise angles, designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. Belgian gates, massive steel frameworks weighing tons, Czech hedgehogs, welded steel bars that could shred a hull, tetrahedra, pyramid-shaped obstacles that could puncture thin metal, wooden stakes topped with telemines in the surf, ready to detonate against landing craft hulls. Mines were everywhere. 4 million anti-tank and anti-personnel mines along the coast. The density was calculated. 1 mine every 2 meters in critical sectors. Anti-personnel mines to kill infantry, anti-tank mines to stop armor, telemines that could destroy a Sherman with a single blast. Behind the beaches, concrete bunkers housed machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank guns with interlocking fields of fire. The Germans had surveyed every meter of beach. They knew the exact ranges. Guns were pre-registered on likely landing zones. Barbed wire tangled along the high water mark, triple rows in places. Anti-tank ditches waited beyond, deep enough to trap a tank too wide to cross. The Germans had spent 2 years preparing these defenses. They were ready. The question was whether the Allies could overcome them without losing so many men in the first 10 minutes that the invasion would collapse. Enter Major General Percy Stanley Hobart, educated at Temple Grove School and Clifton College. In his youth, he studied history, painting, literature, church architecture. Not the typical background for a military revolutionary. But Hobart was never typical. He graduated from the Royal Military Academy, Woolwich, in 1904 and was commissioned into the Royal Engineers. The Royal Engineers, not the cavalry, not the infantry, engineers, problem solvers. Men who understood that war was as much about logistics and technology as it was about courage. Hobart served in India, then France during World War I, then Mesopotamia. He saw mechanization beginning to transform warfare. He understood what it meant. In 1923, when most British officers still worshipped the horse and viewed tanks as temporary aberrations, Hobart volunteered to transfer to the Royal Tank Corps. He'd seen the future, and it ran on treads. This was professional suicide in the British Army of 1923. The cavalry lobby was powerful. Tanks were viewed with suspicion by senior officers who'd built their careers on horsemanship. But Hobart didn't care. He was right, and he knew he was right. By 1934, he commanded Britain's first permanent armoured brigade. He wrote articles about tank warfare, about mobility, about deep penetration operations. His work was studied across Europe. German General Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, paid to have Hobart's articles translated into German. He read them carefully, applied the lessons. The irony would later be bitter. British tank doctrine influenced German panzer tactics, which were then used to devastating effect against British forces in France in 1940. Hobart trained the 7th Armoured Division in Egypt, starting in 1938, transforming it into one of the most effective armoured formations in the British Army. This unit would become legendary as the Desert Rats, fighting across North Africa with distinction. But Hobart never led them in combat. He was too difficult, too abrasive, too certain of his own correctness. He made enemies among senior commanders who resented his dismissive attitude toward their conventional thinking. He was right more often than he was wrong, but being right didn't make him popular. In November 1939, Lieutenant General Henry Maitland Wilson wrote a letter to General Archibald Wavell recommending Hobart be relieved of command. Wilson cited Hobart's over-centralization of command and his heretical tactical ideas based on the invincibility of tanks to the exclusion of other arms. The letter ended, "I request, therefore, that a new commander be appointed to the armoured division." Wavell agreed. At age 54, at the height of his expertise, one of Britain's finest tank warfare theorists was finished. He returned to England. He became a corporal in the Home Guard. A corporal, consider that for a moment. A major general with 2 decades of experience in armoured warfare, who had trained Germany's finest panzer general, who had built the Desert Rats from nothing, spent 1940 and early 1941 drilling with shopkeepers and pensioners armed with rifles from the previous war. The waste was almost criminal. But it was also typical of how large institutions handle innovators who don't fit. He was too smart, too impatient, too convinced of his own vision. The British Army had no place for him, so it put him in the Home Guard and forgot about him. Almost. Basil Liddell Hart, the military theorist and journalist, knew Hobart well. They'd corresponded for years. Liddell Hart understood what the army had discarded. In 1941, he wrote articles in British newspapers about Hobart's forced retirement, about the absurdity of having such expertise wasted on Home Guard duty. Winston Churchill read those articles. The Prime Minister had his own problems with military bureaucracy. He understood institutional resistance to unconventional thinking. In 1941, Churchill personally ordered the army to recall Hobart to active service. The generals resisted. Churchill insisted. Hobart was given command of the 11th Armoured Division and told to train them for combat. He did, brilliantly, but the division was shipped to North Africa in 1942 without him. Too old, they said, too difficult. So once again, he was sidelined. This time, though, Churchill and Chief of the Imperial General Staff Alan Brooke had a different problem that needed Hobart's particular talents. August 19, 1942. The Dieppe raid, Operation Jubilee, had been a catastrophe. The raid was meant to test German defences, to gather intelligence, to demonstrate Allied capability to mount amphibious operations. Instead, it demonstrated only that conventional amphibious assault against prepared defences was nearly impossible. The Canadians who went ashore at Dieppe faced fortifications they couldn't breach, obstacles they couldn't clear, and defences they couldn't suppress. Naval gunfire had been ineffective against concrete bunkers. Aerial bombardment had been cancelled due to concerns about civilian casualties. The infantry went in essentially unsupported. The tanks that did make it to shore found the Churt beach impossible to navigate. Their tracks slipped and broke. They couldn't climb the seawall. Those that tried to push into the town found narrow streets blocked by concrete obstacles. Every tank that landed was either destroyed or captured. The lessons were brutal but clear. You couldn't take a defended port by frontal assault. You needed overwhelming firepower. You needed specialized equipment for specific obstacles. You needed armor that could swim, clear mines, destroy bunkers, bridge ditches, and lay roadways across soft sand. None of this equipment existed in August 1942. It would have to be invented. More accurately, it would have to be developed, because most of the concepts already existed in experimental or limited form. What was needed was someone who could take these concepts, debug them, make them reliable, and integrate them into a coherent system. What was needed, in other words, was Percy Hobart. March 1943. Alan Brooke called Hobart to his London office. The chief of the Imperial General Staff had a problem. Operation Overlord, the invasion of northwest Europe, was scheduled for 1944. The planning was already underway. The Allies would land on the beaches of Normandy with the largest amphibious force in history. If the invasion failed at the waterline, if the assault forces couldn't get off the beaches, the war might be lost. At minimum, it would be prolonged by years. Brooke needed specialized armor for specialized tasks. He needed someone who could develop and train a unit to use that armor. He needed someone who could think unconventionally, who could solve problems that had never been solved before, who could work under impossible time pressure. When Brooke offered Hobart command of the 79th Armored Division with the mission of developing specialized assault armor, Hobart was suspicious. He'd been burned too many times. He asked for time to think about it. Brooke agreed. Hobart went to find Liddell Hart. He tracked him down at the house of friends in Stoke Hammond, outside London. They walked in the garden. Was this real? Or was it another setup, another assignment that would be taken away? Liddell Hart told him this was real. This was his opportunity, his last opportunity. The 79th would be the biggest division in the British Army, the first all-armoured division. If Hobart could pull this off, if he could develop the equipment and tactics to crack the Atlantic Wall, he would validate everything he'd argued for his entire career. Hobart's resistance crumbled. He took the job. The 79th Armoured Division would never fight as a division. This was unusual, but it was the only way to make the concept work. Instead of concentrating its units, the 79th became a holding formation for specialized vehicles that would be attached to assault formations as needed. A squadron of mine-clearing tanks here, an AVRE section there, flame-throwing tanks for this attack, amphibious tanks for that landing. The 79th existed to provide capabilities, not to fight as a coherent unit. Hobart's mission was simple to state, impossible to execute: develop the machines and tactics that could get men across a defended beach alive, and train the crews to use them effectively. He had roughly a year, maybe 15 months if he was lucky. The clock was running. Work began immediately. The 79th's headquarters was established at Herts Hall in Saxmundham, Suffolk. The property was requisitioned by the Ministry of Defence. Nearby beaches and fields became testing grounds. The Layers, an area of land south of Saxmundham, saw constant activity. Tanks churned across the landscape, testing modifications, identifying problems, finding solutions. Hobart assembled engineers, tank crews, inventors, anyone who had ideas about specialized armor. He gathered every half-baked concept from anywhere in Britain and the Commonwealth. Mine-clearing tanks had been tried in North Africa. The Scorpion flail tank, a modified Matilda, had seen combat. It worked, sort of. Sometimes. The Soviets had experimented with mine rollers on T-34 tanks. The concept was sound, but the execution was rough. Bridge-laying tanks existed, fascine carriers existed, flamethrower tanks had been built, but nobody had put it all together. Nobody had taken these disparate concepts and turned them into reliable, combat-ready systems. Nobody had debugged the devices and made them actually work under battlefield conditions. That was Hobart's job. That was his genius. The genius wasn't in inventing from scratch. Hobart wasn't Thomas Edison. He wasn't Alexander Graham Bell. He was more like Henry Ford, taking existing concepts and making them work reliably at scale. The principles of mine-clearing tanks were known. The challenge was making them effective in combat. Different drum rotation speeds, different approaches to protecting the mechanism from enemy fire. The crab emerged from these tests. A Sherman tank with a rotating drum mounted on the front. 43 weighted chains hung from this drum. When the drums spun at high speed, powered by the tank's engine, the chains flailed the ground ahead of the tank, detonating pressure mines by simulating the weight of a vehicle. The explosion would destroy a chain or two, but there were 43 chains, and they were easily replaced. A single crab could clear a lane through a minefield 9 feet wide at walking speed. The tank could fight while flailing. Its main gun remained operational. The crew could raise and lower the flail drum using hydraulics. If they encountered an obstacle, they'd raise the drum, navigate around it, lower the drum, and continue flailing. It worked. More importantly, it worked consistently. Test after test showed reliability. Crews could be trained to use it. It could be maintained in the field. It solved the problem. The RV, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, became the most versatile platform in the arsenal. Built on a Churchill chassis, the RV retained the hull, turret structure, and mechanical components of the base tank, but was adapted extensively. The interior was stripped of standard equipment to allow stowage of engineering stores. Crews carried everything they might need: explosives, tools, bridging materials, fascines. The Churchill's main gun, the 6-pounder, was replaced with a weapon unlike anything else in service, the petard, a 290mm spigot mortar. The petard fired a projectile the crews nicknamed the Flying Dustbin, a 40-pound high-explosive charge shaped like a trash can. The physics were simple but effective. The round was designed to demolish concrete fortifications. Range was limited, only about 80 meters, but accuracy was excellent and the effect was devastating. A direct hit from a petard could blow a hole in reinforced concrete large enough for infantry to climb through. German bunkers that would have required hours of work with conventional explosives could be neutralized in seconds. The psychological impact on defenders was significant. Watching a 40-pound explosive charge arc toward your position concentrated the mind wonderfully. Many German soldiers abandoned bunkers after petard rounds started landing nearby, even if the bunkers weren't directly hit. But the RVRE was more than just a demolition vehicle. It was a platform for multiple specialized attachments. RVREs could carry fascines, enormous bundles of wooden stakes bound together with wire, typically 8 feet in diameter and 11 feet long. When the AVERE encountered an anti-tank ditch or steep drop, the crew would drive to the edge, stop, and release the fascine. It would roll forward into the gap. The AVERE would then drive over it, using the fascine as a bridge. Following vehicles could cross the same way. The fascine was left in place, creating a permanent crossing point. Simple, effective, solved a problem that had stopped tanks for decades. Other AVRE variants carried bridge sections, portable bridges that could span obstacles up to 30 feet wide. The crew would position the AVRE, deploy the bridge using hydraulics, then drive away, leaving the bridge in place for following vehicles. Still other AVREs carried frame charges, massive explosive packages that could be placed against walls or obstacles and detonated remotely. The Bangalore torpedo concept scaled up to tank size. The AVRE crews were Royal Engineers, combat engineers who understood demolitions and construction. They could assess an obstacle, determine the best way to breach it, and execute the breach under fire. They were technical specialists in steel boxes, fighting while engineering. The Churchill Crocodile transformed psychological warfare. The base platform was a standard Churchill infantry tank, but the hull machine gun was replaced with a flame projector. An armored trailer, connected by a flexible pipe and towed behind the tank, carried 400 imperial gallons of thickened fuel. The flame projector could fire in 1-second bursts or sustain jets lasting several seconds. The flame could reach 110 to 120 yards in good conditions, farther than any man-portable flamethrower. The fuel was thickened, meaning it was viscous, sticky, and burned longer and hotter than liquid fuel. When a crocodile opened fire, it created a jet of burning fuel that would splash across bunker apertures, flow into firing slits, pool on the ground, and continue burning. The temperature was extreme, the smoke was choking, the terror was absolute. Nobody wants to be burned alive. German soldiers facing crocodiles often abandoned defensive positions that might have held against conventional tank attacks. The weapon's reputation preceded it. After crocodiles were first used in Normandy, German commanders warned their troops about them. The warnings only made the terror worse. Defenders who saw a crocodile approaching knew what was coming. Many surrendered rather than face the flame. The tactical value was enormous. Strong points that might have required infantry assault with heavy casualties could be neutralized by a single crocodile without friendly losses. The bobbin solved a problem that sounds trivial until you're stuck in soft sand under artillery fire. Some beaches are soft clay or fine sand that can't support a tank's weight, especially a 30-ton Sherman or 40-ton Churchill. Tanks bob down, tracks spin, the vehicle becomes immobile, a stationary target. The bobbin carried a massive roll of reinforced matting on a horizontal drum mounted on the front of the tank. The matting was heavy canvas or Hessian reinforced with metal strips, typically 10 feet wide. As the bobbin advanced, it unrolled this matting, laying it on the ground like carpet. The bobbin's tracks ran on the matting, pressing it firmly into the soft surface. Following vehicles could use the same matting, creating an improvised roadway across terrain that would otherwise be impassable. The concept was so simple it seemed almost silly. It wasn't silly, it was brilliant. Tests showed that bobbins could lay roadway at walking speed. The matting stayed in place. Dozens of vehicles could cross on a single laid track. The difference between success and failure on a beach might be whether your tanks can move or not. The DD tank, duplex drive, approached the problem of getting tanks ashore from a different angle. What if the tanks could swim? The concept wasn't new. Amphibious tanks had been experimented with for years, but making it work reliably was difficult. The DD system used a Sherman tank fitted with a collapsible canvas screen that surrounded the hull, creating a boat-like structure. The screen was raised using compressed air and struts. When raised, it provided enough buoyancy to keep the tank afloat. Propellers mounted on the rear of the tank, driven by power takeoff from the engine, provided propulsion in the water. The tank could motor through water at about 5 miles per hour. Upon reaching shallow water, the crew would drop the screen, which collapsed around the hull. The tank would then drive up the beach as a normal tank and fight with its main gun. The DD concept was elegant. Launch tanks from landing craft thousands of yards offshore, avoiding the concentrated fire on the beach. The tanks swim to shore, land, and immediately provide fire support to the infantry. In calm seas, it worked beautifully. In rough seas, it was dangerous. The canvas screen was only a few feet above the waterline. Waves could swamp the tank. If water came over the screen faster than the bilge pumps could handle, the tank would sink. Crews trained extensively in DDs, learning to handle them in various sea states. The training paid off on some beaches and failed catastrophically on others. The Ark, armored ramp carrier, was perhaps the strangest-looking vehicle in the arsenal. It was a Churchill tank with the turret completely removed and replaced with a flat deck. Extendable steel ramps were fitted to both ends. The Ark's purpose was to become a bridge. When the vehicle encountered a high seawall, steep embankment, or similar vertical obstacle, it would position itself against the obstacle. The crew would extend the ramps, one forward over the obstacle, one backward toward approaching vehicles. Other tanks would then drive up the rear ramp, across the Ark's deck, and down the forward ramp, crossing the obstacle. The Ark crew would evacuate before this happened, because having a 30-ton tank drive over your vehicle is hazardous even when planned. The Ark would be left in place, a sacrificial bridge. It was a one-use vehicle. But that one use could mean the difference between tanks getting off the beach or being trapped at the waterline. Planners determined that several Arks per beach sector was an acceptable trade-off. Churchill tanks were expensive. Battalions of dead infantry were more expensive. There were more specialized vehicles. The Conga fired rockets trailing explosive hoses across minefields, then detonated the hoses to clear a path. The Bullshorn plow used angled blades to push beach obstacles aside. The Canal Defense Light was a Grant tank with a powerful searchlight in the turret for night operations. Each design solved a specific problem. Each had been tested, debugged, and made reliable enough for combat use. By early 1944, the 79th Armored Division possessed the most sophisticated collection of combat engineering vehicles ever assembled. But equipment was only half the solution. Crews had to be trained. Coordination had to be practiced. Doctrine had to be developed. How do you employ these vehicles effectively? What's the proper sequence? DD tanks arrived first to provide immediate fire support. Crabs followed to clear lanes through minefields. AVREs advanced behind the crabs to destroy bunkers and lay bridges. Bobbins work simultaneously to create roadways. Infantry follows the armor, using the cleared paths and suppressed defenses to advance inland. Timing was everything. If the DD tanks arrived too early, they'd be destroyed before infantry could support them. Too late, and infantry would be pinned on the beach without armored support. If crabs didn't clear enough lanes, follow-on forces would bunch up, creating targets for German artillery. If AVREs couldn't get to bunkers quickly, those bunkers would keep firing, inflicting casualties. Every beach was different, every obstacle pattern was unique. Crews had to be flexible, adaptive, capable of independent decision-making under fire. Training began in summer 1943 and continued until the invasion. Mock exercises at Linney Head in Wales brought units together for the first time. The results were revealing. Units landed in the wrong places. Tank landing craft arrived late. Communications failed. Nothing worked smoothly. So they did it again and again. Each iteration revealed new problems. Solutions were developed, tested, refined. By the 10th iteration, operations were beginning to flow. Units trained in Norfolk on beaches similar to Normandy. The clay beaches of Norfolk resembled those of Gold and Juno. Tanks practiced crossing them. When tests showed that some areas were even softer than expected, engineers developed lighter matting variants. Nothing was left to chance. Intelligence gathered detailed information on German obstacles. Engineers studied photographs, built models, determined exactly which equipment would be needed at which locations. If a specific bunker needed to be destroyed, an AVRE would be assigned. If a particular minefield needed clearing, crabs would be allocated. Planning became granular. In February 1944, Hobart demonstrated the Funnies to American commanders. Winston Churchill attended. So did Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, Hobart's brother-in-law. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, watched carefully. He understood immediately what these vehicles could accomplish. General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army scheduled to land at Omaha and Utah beaches, was impressed. On February 16, 1944, Bradley requested 100 DD tanks, 25 crabs, and 100 crocodiles for American use. The British War Office agreed in principle. But there was a problem: production capacity. The British and Canadian forces needed Funnies for Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. There weren't enough vehicles to meet both Commonwealth and American requirements. Building more crabs and crocodiles took time. The specialized modifications couldn't be rushed. Training took months. There simply wasn't enough time before D-Day to produce the vehicles Bradley wanted and train American crews to use them. The Americans would get DD tanks, which were being produced in the United States as well as Britain, and conventional Sherman bulldozers. Nothing else. Bradley later said he understood the Funnies' usefulness, but understanding and having them were different things. The night of June 5, 1944, Hobart's units dispersed across southern England. They weren't concentrated, they were attached to assault formations up and down the invasion coast. The 22nd Dragoons with their DD tanks, the Westminster Dragoons with their crabs, the assault squadron's Royal Engineers with their AVREs. Elements of the 79th Armoured Division were embedded with the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division heading for Gold Beach, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division heading for Juno, the 3rd British Infantry Division heading for Sword. Each assault brigade had specialized armor attached based on the specific obstacles they'd face. The bull's head insignia of the 79th Armored Division rode on hundreds of tanks, preparing for the greatest amphibious invasion in history. June 6, 1944, began in darkness. At 0325 hours, aerial and naval bombardment started hammering German coastal positions. RAF and American heavy bombers had struck during the night. Now warships added their weight. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers poured shells onto known German positions. The bombardment was impressive. It was also insufficient. Many German positions were too well protected to be damaged by indirect fire. Concrete bunkers 3 feet thick could withstand anything except a direct hit from the largest guns. The specialized armor would have to deal with whatever survived the bombardment. At 0725 hours, the 1st British and Canadian units hit their beaches. The timing was staggered based on tides. The landings weren't simultaneous, but within 30 minutes, all 3 British and Canadian beaches were under assault. On Gold Beach, DD tanks of the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards launched 5,000 yards offshore. The seas were rough but manageable. They rose from the water like mechanical ghosts, shedding their canvas screens. Turrets rotating toward German positions, 75mm guns opening fire while still in the surf. Behind them, landing craft carrying the assault waves of the 50th Northumbrian Division. The infantry saw the DD tanks firing and knew they had armoured support immediately. Behind the infantry, more landing craft carrying crabs, AVREs, bobbins. The specialised armour landed close behind the first wave. Within minutes, crabs were flailing paths through minefields. German machine gun fire hammered at their armour, the chains kept spinning. Mines detonated in sequence, flashes of sand and smoke marking the cleared lanes. AVREs waddled toward bunkers, turrets traversing, petards firing at point-blank range. The flying dustbins arced through the air, 40 pounds of high explosive impacting concrete. Bunkers blew apart. Crews reloaded, moving to the next target. Fascines filled anti-tank ditches. Bobbins laid roadway over soft sand. The system worked. The specialized armor did exactly what it was designed to do. By 0900 hours, Gold Beach was secured. British forces were pushing inland. Casualties were significant, approximately 400 killed, 600 wounded. Painful, but manageable. The beach hadn't become a slaughterhouse. Juno Beach, the Canadian sector, started rough. The tide was wrong. Landing craft grounded on offshore reefs earlier than expected. Men waded through chest-deep water instead of ankle-deep. German fire was heavy. The 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade and the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade came ashore under withering machine gun and mortar fire. Casualties mounted on the waterline. But the Funnies landed right behind them. DD tanks of the 6th Canadian Armoured Regiment, 1st Hussars, and the 10th Canadian Armoured Regiment, Fort Garry Horse, provided immediate fire support. Some had launched close to shore due to rough seas. Others swam in from farther out. Either way, they were firing within minutes of the infantry landing. Crabs of the 22nd Dragoons, attached to Canadian forces, flailed lanes through minefields. AVREs of the 5th and 6th Assault Regiment, Royal Engineers demolished bunkers and strongpoints. The specialised armour gave the Canadians options. Instead of trying to assault bunkers with rifles and grenades, they could call up an AVRE. Instead of navigating through minefields by probing with bayonets, they could follow a crab. The Canadians, fighting with fury, remembering Dieppe, broke through the coastal defences by mid-morning. They advanced farther inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day, nearly reaching Cannes. Total casualties at Juno, 340 Canadians killed, 50-74 wounded, 47 captured, plus 243 British killed, wounded or missing. Over 1,200 total casualties. It was the second deadliest of the 5 beaches. But it wasn't Dieppe. The assault succeeded. The specialised armour had made the difference. Sword Beach saw the 3rd British Infantry Division land at 0725 under heavy fire. DD tanks of the 13th U-18th Royal Hussars came ashore first, guns blazing. Royal Engineers in AVREs followed immediately. German defenders fought hard from positions around Ouistreham and the fortified casino, but the combination of DD tanks providing fire support and AVREs demolishing strongpoints gave British forces the tools they needed. Crabs cleared lanes. Bobbins laid matting. Infantry advanced behind the armour, using suppressed defences to push inland. By midday, Sword Beach was secured, and British forces were moving toward Cannes. Total casualties on Sword, approximately 600 NT killed, wounded or captured, the lowest of any beach. The Funnies had worked as designed. Now contrast this with Omaha Beach, the American sector. General Bradley had declined most of the Funnies due to time constraints and logistical concerns. American forces would land with DD tanks and conventional Sherman bulldozers. The DD tanks launched 6,000 yards offshore into rough seas. The decision was made by commanders who'd never trained with DDs in heavy weather. 27 of 32 DD tanks sank before reaching shore. Crews drowned or were killed in the water by German fire. The 5 DD tanks that made it to shore immediately bogged down in soft sand. Their tracks spun. They couldn't maneuver. German anti-tank guns knocked them out one by one. The infantry came ashore without armoured support, without mine-clearing tanks, without bunker-busting tanks, without any of the specialised equipment the British and Canadians had. The result was slaughter. Men pinned on the beach by machine gun fire from bunkers they couldn't suppress. Mines detonated, killing and maiming. Steel obstacles shredded landing craft. Casualties mounted by the minute. For hours, the outcome at Omaha was genuinely in doubt. Only extraordinary courage by individual soldiers and junior officers saved the landing. Staff Sergeant William Maddox of the 49th Engineer Combat Battalion organized men to blow gaps in obstacles under fire. Brigadier General Norman Cotter personally led infantry off the beach. Individual squad leaders took initiative when their officers were killed. By late afternoon, American forces had secured a toehold at Omaha, but at terrible cost. Approximately 2,500 casualties, almost half of all Allied D-Day casualties, happened on one beach, Omaha Beach. The difference wasn't courage. American soldiers were as brave as any soldiers in any army. The difference wasn't training or leadership, the difference was equipment. The British and Canadians had specialized tools designed specifically for the obstacles they'd face. The Americans had courage and conventional equipment. Courage wasn't enough. German defenders at Omaha later reported they couldn't understand how anyone survived the first hour. They'd inflicted casualties at a rate that should have broken the assault. But Americans kept coming, kept advancing, kept fighting. British and German soldiers who fought at Gold, Juno and Sword understood perfectly well why those assaults succeeded more smoothly. The Funnies had done their job. They'd cleared mines. They'd demolished bunkers. They'd bridged obstacles. They'd given assault forces the tools they needed to overcome prepared defenses without losing half their strength on the beach. Sergeant Davies moved inland from Gold Beach that afternoon, following the advancing infantry. Around him, the evidence of Hobart's vision was everywhere. Lanes cleared through minefields marked with white tape, anti-tank ditches filled with fascines, vehicles crossing easily, smashed bunkers with holes blown through reinforced concrete walls. The beach obstacles that should have stopped the invasion had been methodically neutralized by specialized armor working in coordination with infantry and engineers. Some Funnies were knocked out, burning hulks on the sand, but most had done what they were built to do and moved forward with the assault. Davies saw a crab still working, flailing a path toward Arromanches, its chains throwing up dirt and smoke. An AVRE sat beside a demolished pillbox, crew taking a smoking break, their petard having done its job. A crocodile rumbled past, trailing its fuel bowser, heading inland to deal with whatever German positions remained. The system worked. That was the essential thing. Under fire, under pressure, facing real German defenses, Hobart's system worked. The specialized armor continued operating throughout the Normandy campaign and beyond. Hobart's units were attached to formations as needed, providing capabilities for specific operations. In September 1944, when Allied forces attacked the heavily fortified French port of Brest, crocodiles broke German resistance at Fort Montbarry. A single crocodile, commanded by Lieutenant Andrew Wilson Ward, advanced through minefields and anti-tank ditches with its flame projector firing continuously. The psychological effect was devastating. 75 German paratroopers, elite fighters who'd held their positions against infantry assaults, surrendered rather than face the fire. The port fell shortly after. When Allied forces opened the Scheldt estuary in October and November 1944, clearing German positions from flooded Dutch polders, specialized armor from the 79th proved essential. AVREs bridged canals, crabs cleared mines from dikes. The expertise developed for beach assault transferred to other types of operations. By war's end, the 79th Armored Division numbered nearly 7,000 vehicles. Not all were Funnies, but the specialized armor formed the division's core capability. These machines fought in every major British operation from D-Day to the Rhine crossing in March 1945. They supported the breakout from Normandy. They breached the Siegfried Line. They crossed the Rhine on improvised bridges laid by AVREs. They saved thousands of lives by giving assault forces the tools needed for specific obstacles. Other nations learned. After the war, specialized combat engineering vehicles became standard in modern armies. The Soviets developed the IMR engineer tank based on the T-72. The Americans created multiple variants: the M728 combat engineer vehicle, the M60 AVLB bridge layer, the M9 armored combat earthmover. The Israelis, facing continuous conflict, developed extensive specialized armor, including heavily armored bulldozers. The concept of purpose-built vehicles for combat engineering tasks became doctrine worldwide. But in 1944, it was revolutionary. It was Hobart's vision, refined into steel and proven under fire on the beaches of Normandy. Percy Hobart never personally commanded troops in combat during World War II. His contribution was developmental, organizational, doctrinal. He took a problem that had seemed nearly unsolvable, broke it into components, developed solutions for each component, integrated those solutions into a coherent system, trained men to use that system, and delivered it on time for the most important operation of the war. He retired in 1946 at age 61. The 79th Armored Division was disbanded in August 1945, its mission complete. Hobart died February 19, 1957, in Farnham, Surrey. He was 71. Basil Liddell Hart, who had championed him when the army wanted to forget him, wrote, "To have moulded the best two British armoured divisions of the war was an outstanding achievement, but Hobart made it a hat-trick by his subsequent training of the specialised 79th Armoured Division, the decisive factor on D-Day." The decisive factor. Those words bear examination. D-Day succeeded because of many factors working together. Deception operations that convinced Germans the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais. Air superiority that prevented Luftwaffe interference. Naval supremacy that protected the invasion fleet. The courage of soldiers who crossed those beaches under fire knowing they might die. The leadership of officers who made good decisions under impossible pressure. All of this mattered. But specialized armor was a force multiplier that transformed heavily defended positions from potentially insurmountable obstacles into manageable problems. It reduced casualties, it increased the speed of assault, it gave commanders options beyond frontal infantry attack. Without the Funnies, British and Canadian casualties would have resembled Omaha Beach or worse. There's something profound about how one difficult, abrasive engineer's vision changed the calculus of amphibious warfare. Hobart wasn't easy to work with, he knew he was right and didn't suffer fools. The British Army forced him into retirement twice because he didn't fit institutional norms. Only Winston Churchill's personal intervention brought him back. If Churchill hadn't read Liddell Hart's articles, if Alan Brooke hadn't needed someone who could think unconventionally, if Dieppe hadn't demonstrated the inadequacy of conventional assault methods, Hobart's Funnies might never have existed. D-Day might have failed. The war might have lasted longer. Tens of thousands more might have died. We can't know alternate histories, but we know this history. On June 6, 1944, British and Canadian forces landed on 3 heavily defended beaches using specialized armor designed specifically for beach assault. They suffered significant casualties but broke through defenses relatively quickly and advanced inland. American forces landing at Omaha Beach without specialized armor suffered horrific casualties and barely held their beachhead. The beaches were similar, the defenders were similar, the courage was similar, the equipment was different. That difference was measurable in lives saved and objectives achieved. Technology, properly applied by men who understood both the technology and the problem it was meant to solve, changed history.